The police officers decided to intimidate Chuck Norris' wife right in the parking lot by pointing their guns at her. But her one phone call to her husband proved to be a fatal mistake for them. Subscribe so you don't miss any new stories, and write in the comments which city you're watching from. The Texas summer heat was the kind that made the air itself seem heavy, pressing down on everything beneath it. The late afternoon sun glared from a cloudless sky, turning the cracked asphalt of the small-town streets into a shimmering, liquid mirage. Heat waves rose from the hoods of parked cars, and the smell of baked metal mixed with the dry scent of dust carried on the occasional gust of wind. In this town, as in so many like it, life slowed to a crawl when the mercury climbed. Shops were locked up until evening, blinds drawn tight against the light. Only the faint hum of an old air conditioning unit and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere in the neighborhood broke the stillness. Gina O'Kelly eased her car down the main road, her hands relaxed but steady on the steering wheel. She'd just finished several hours at a local children's center where she'd been helping organize a small charity event, handing out toys, reading stories, and chatting with parents. The trunk was still filled with colorful gift bags that smelled faintly of new plastic and sugar from the candy tucked inside. On the passenger seat sat a tote bag with her own documents, a folder of photos from the day, and a few personal items she had brought along. She felt good about the work she'd done, though the heat had begun to sap her energy. Up ahead, she spotted a small convenience store, the kind of place that seemed untouched by time, with a faded sign above the door and a pair of vending machines out front. A cold bottle of water was all she wanted before continuing the drive home. She pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, noting that aside from two old pickup trucks on the far side, there was no one around. It was quiet, too quiet, in a way that made the sound of her engine switching off seem louder than it should have been. She removed her sunglasses and glanced around. A line of low buildings hugged the far edge of the lot, their peeling paint speaking of years without fresh upkeep. An empty lot stretched beyond a chain-link fence to her right, where tufts of dry grass bent in the occasional hot breeze. Gina stepped out of the car, the heat hitting her like the opening of an oven. Her sandals clicked softly against the pavement as she walked toward the store. She was casually dressed, light cotton pants, a sleeveless blouse in pale blue, and her long, blonde-brown hair was tied back in a loose ponytail to keep it off her neck. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had been in the public eye before, but didn't live in it. Her focus was on the vending machine in front of the store when the distant hum of an engine drew her attention. A white patrol car turned into the lot, moving slowly, deliberately. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, just the steady roll of tires over the cracked asphalt until it came to a stop diagonally across two spaces, close enough to block part of the exit. The air shifted. Something about the way it arrived, without any apparent reason, made her shoulders stiffen just slightly. Two officers emerged from the car. The first was heavy-set, broad across the chest and neck, his uniform fitting snugly over a thick midsection. His short-cropped hair was already showing streaks of gray, and his eyes swept the parking lot like someone checking the territory before closing in. The other was younger, leaner, with a quick, restless way of moving. His mouth curved into a smirk almost as soon as his eyes settled on her. They exchanged a look that spoke of unspoken understanding before they began walking toward her. The sound of their boots on the asphalt was distinct in the still air, a steady rhythm that matched their unhurried pace. Gina turned slightly, facing them as they approached, and offered a polite nod. She had lived in Texas long enough to know the value of courtesy, especially in small towns where everyone seemed to know one another. But these men did not approach like officers greeting a local resident. Their eyes traveled over her in a way that was assessing, but not in the professional sense. This was personal. The older one's gaze lingered a fraction too long before he shifted it to her car, then back to her face. The younger's smirk deepened as if he found something amusing that he hadn't shared. She kept her posture relaxed, though her instincts had begun to hum quietly at the back of her mind. She didn't know them, but the way they carried themselves told her more than she wanted to know. They moved like men who had learned they could get away with things, and their silence in those first few seconds was a pressure of its own. She gestured toward the store, as if to signal her destination, but they closed the space between them a little faster now. The older officer's hand brushed the belt at his waist in a subtle but unmistakable display of authority, while the younger's eyes didn't leave her face, scanning for reactions. The hot wind passed again, tugging faintly at her blouse, but the heat in the air now came from somewhere else entirely. The parking lot seemed suddenly smaller, the open space narrowing as they positioned themselves between her and the store. A voice in the back of her mind, one that had carried her safely through more than one uncomfortable situation, told her this was no casual encounter. These men hadn't stopped because of a traffic infraction or to check on a community member. This was something else, and while she didn't yet know exactly what, she could feel it in the slow, deliberate way they were closing the distance, in the way they watched her without a hint of professional detachment. From the corner of her eye, she saw the older one glance toward her car again. She knew her vehicle was clean, no reason for them to question it, but she also knew that people looking for trouble rarely cared about reason. Her skin prickled despite the oppressive heat. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She took a breath, steady and quiet, and made a decision then and there. She would meet this head-on, calm and clear, and without giving them anything they could twist against her. But deep down in the place where instincts live, she also knew she had a line she wouldn't let them cross. And if they tried, there was one person she could call who would make sure they regretted every step they'd taken toward her. The lot was still, the heat unrelenting, as they came to a stop in front of her. The older officer's presence filled the space between them as he shifted his stance slightly, squaring his shoulders, his hands still resting near the belt where his holstered sidearm sat. The younger one hung back just half a step, letting his senior take the lead, but watching everything with the sharpness of someone who enjoyed the game before the trap was fully sprung. His smirk was constant, a twitch at the corner of his mouth that was equal parts arrogance and anticipation. They began with voices that carried the easy cadence of small-town politeness, the kind that to an outsider might sound welcoming, but beneath the surface carried a weight meant to press on the other person. The older one spoke first, his tone slow and measured, as though he were making casual conversation. He asked where she was headed on such a hot day, if she was from around here, if she'd been at the children's center that afternoon. Each question was harmless on the surface, but the way his eyes tracked her reactions told a different story. The younger officer's interjections came lighter, almost teasing, but with a thread of something unpleasant woven through. He commented on the heat, then on her outfit, noting that she must be used to turning heads. It was presented like a joke, but his eyes didn't smile with the words. They held a certain sharpness, watching for discomfort. Gina kept her expression composed, answering briefly, neither defensive nor overly friendly, but the change in their posture told her they weren't here for idle talk. As the questions continued, the veneer of courtesy began to erode. The older one stepped a little closer, invading the bubble of space she instinctively maintained. His gaze drifted slowly from her face to her shoulders, then to the tote bag on the seat of her car. He asked if it was hers, though it was an absurd question with her standing right there, keys in hand. The younger officer circled slightly to her left, his boots scuffing the asphalt, moving in a slow arc that shifted her awareness from one to the other, forcing her to keep track of both. The air between them changed, no longer the false ease of polite questioning, but something heavier. The older officer's voice took on a note of condescension, as though he were addressing someone far beneath his authority. He spoke about how women shouldn't be traveling alone in certain parts of town, that it was easy to get into trouble if you weren't careful. The words might have sounded like concern to someone else, but to Gina, the meaning was clear. They were telling her she was at their mercy here. The younger one gave a quiet laugh, shaking his head as if amused by something she'd said, though she hadn't made a joke. His eyes swept over her again, not quickly, but with the kind of lingering assessment that made her stomach tighten. She kept her stance relaxed, shifting her weight slightly, but her instincts were screaming that the polite portion of this encounter was nearly over. The first breach of physical space came without warning. As she angled slightly toward the store, the older officer stepped into her path and let his fingers brush against her forearm, the contact deliberate, though he masked it with an air of casualness. She pulled back subtly, not wanting to escalate, but the message was received. He was testing her boundaries. The younger officer's smirk grew as though they were sharing an unspoken agreement. Then came the pivot into something undeniably threatening. The older officer tilted his head toward her car and remarked that he might need to take a look inside, his tone making it sound like a favor rather than an order. She knew full well there was no legal reason for him to do so, but the way his hand lingered near his holster spoke to a different set of rules. She kept her voice calm, asking if there was a reason, but the response was a shrug, the kind that said reason wasn't necessary here. The younger officer moved closer now, closing the gap until he was well within arm's reach. He held something small in his hand. At first she thought it might be his radio, but when he adjusted his grip, she saw the glint of metal. He was holding a pair of handcuffs, idly letting them dangle by one loop, the faint clink of the steel against his fingers, almost lost in the hum of the heat. He twirled them once before letting them hang again, his gaze locked on her as if waiting for a reaction. She didn't give him one. Inside, her pulse had quickened, but outwardly she remained still, her breathing steady. The older officer glanced at his partner and gave a slow nod, as though some unspoken decision had been reached. He shifted his weight and in one smooth motion unfastened the strap on his holster. The move was subtle, but there was no mistaking it. He was preparing to draw. The space around them seemed to shrink. The sun beat down mercilessly, but she barely felt it now. Her focus narrowed to the two men in front of her. The older one let his hand rest openly on the grip of his pistol, not raising it yet, but making it clear he could at any moment. The younger took half a step behind her, close enough that she could sense his presence without turning. Gina knew then that whatever this had started as, some perverse blend of intimidation and amusement, it had shifted fully into danger. This wasn't a bluff or a warning. They were pushing toward a confrontation where they controlled the terms. Her instincts told her she was seconds away from losing control of the situation entirely. She didn't look toward her phone right away, though the thought of it had already formed in her mind. She knew that any sudden movement could escalate things instantly. She kept her gaze level, her posture calm, and she began to weigh her next move carefully. If they tried to touch her again, if they tried to force her toward the patrol car, she would need to act quickly. And she knew exactly who she would call. Not the local department, not anyone who might be in league with them, but someone who would end this before it went any further. For now, though, she stood still, the sun hot on her back, the two men closing in just enough to remind her they could. The sound of the cuffs in the younger officer's hand and the almost inaudible click of the holster strap releasing would stay with her long after this moment was over. She understood one thing with absolute clarity. The polite mask was gone, and the threat was here, real and immediate. And she was done giving them the satisfaction of believing she was powerless. Gina's thoughts had narrowed to a fine point. Every instinct told her she was standing on a razor's edge, one wrong move away from something she couldn't walk back. The older officer's hand lingered on the grip of his pistol. The younger's cuffs dangled loosely at his side, and both seemed entirely confident in their control of the moment. The sun still blazed down, but the heat on her skin was nothing compared to the tight coil winding in her chest. She had no intention of letting them dictate what happened next, but she also knew that overt defiance without leverage could push them into immediate violence. That was the balance she had to maintain, projecting calm while quietly building her own escape. She let a beat pass, eyes steady on the older man's face, as if she were weighing his words. In truth, her mind had already reached its conclusion. She had one person in the world who could end this with finality, who wouldn't waste time asking questions or giving them the benefit of the doubt. She needed to reach him, and she needed to do it without triggering the jumpy nerves of the man behind her. Moving slowly, she shifted her weight as though simply adjusting her stance. Her right hand slid casually into the pocket of her light cotton pants. The movement was small, unhurried, designed to seem like nothing at all. Her fingers found the cool surface of her phone. She drew it out just enough to see the screen, her thumb sweeping across to wake it. The glare from the sun made the glass hard to read, but she didn't need to see much. She knew the exact position of the one number she'd marked as her fastest connection. Neither man spoke, though she could feel the younger one's gaze on her back like a hand pressing forward. The older officer's jaw shifted slightly, chewing at the inside of his cheek as if calculating his next line. She tapped the contact without hesitation. The phone barely rang before the connection clicked open. She didn't waste words. The voice on the other end was one she'd known for over 2 decades, one that could change from warmth to steel in an instant. She spoke with clipped precision, giving her location, naming the threat in the fewest possible terms, each syllable carefully measured so as not to betray the depth of the situation to the 2 men surrounding her. The tone she used was calm, but beneath it, there was an urgency that the man on the other end of the line would recognize immediately. In a quiet gym less than 15 minutes away, Chuck Norris was midway through a training demonstration with a pair of students when his phone vibrated on the bench beside the mats. He had been laughing a moment earlier, explaining a fine detail in a blocking sequence, but the second he saw her name flash across the screen, something inside him went still. He stepped away from the students without breaking eye contact with the phone. The moment he heard her voice steady, yes, but with those calculated pauses he knew so well. His expression changed. He listened without interrupting, the lines around his eyes hardening as the short, precise facts came through. He didn't ask for clarification, didn't request that she hand the phone to anyone else. He knew better than to put her in a position where she'd have to escalate prematurely. He also knew from the cadence of her breathing that she was already surrounded. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. When it ended, Chuck was already moving toward the corner of the gym where his bag sat. He grabbed the keys to his black pickup, the same one he had driven for years, and slung his jacket over one arm. He didn't bother to explain to the students or the trainer what was happening. The look in his eyes was enough to tell them it was serious. Outside, the heat slammed into him, but he barely registered it. He slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, the growl of the tuned motor filling the quiet street outside the gym. As he pulled out, his mind was already mapping the fastest route, cutting through side roads and skirting the edge of the main drag to avoid any slowdowns. His foot was heavier on the gas than usual, but his movements remained smooth, controlled. Chuck Norris did not panic. He calculated. Back in the parking lot, Gina had ended the call without any visible change in her expression. She returned the phone to her pocket with the same deliberate calm, her gaze never leaving the older officer's face. He gave a short, humorless chuckle, perhaps interpreting her composure as compliance, perhaps sensing nothing at all. The younger officer shifted slightly behind her, still toying with the cuffs, the faint metallic sound carrying in the still heat. Inside, she felt the smallest shift, something between relief and readiness. She had done her part. Now all she had to do was hold her ground until he arrived. She was acutely aware that in this moment, the men around her believed themselves untouchable. They didn't know that every second was bringing them closer to the end of that illusion. The older officer finally spoke again, his voice dropping into the slow drawl of someone delivering a verdict. He suggested that they continue this conversation in a more private location, glancing toward the open back door of the patrol car. The younger officer took a step forward in response, his shadow overlapping hers. She didn't move. The key now was time stretching these moments without giving them a reason to rush. She shifted her gaze briefly toward the edge of the lot, just enough to note the way the distant shimmer of the asphalt seemed to ripple more heavily in the heat. It could have been anything, a truck passing on a far-off street, a trick of light. But in her mind, she could already picture the black pickup cutting through that mirage, eating up the distance between them. In the cab of that truck, Chuck's hands were steady on the wheel, his mind rehearsing not words but movements. Years of competition, training, and real-world encounters had honed his ability to switch from calm to decisive action in a fraction of a second. He didn't dwell on what-ifs. He thought in terms of position, approach, leverage, control. He knew from the tone of her voice that they were armed, that they were too close, that one was behind her. He dealt with worse. He also knew that intimidation worked only when unchallenged, and that the men who thrived on it tended to crumble when the balance of power shifted abruptly. That shift was coming. Back at the store, Gina felt the younger officer draw closer again, his shadow stretching across her feet. The older one's hand was still on his weapon, his eyes scanning her face for signs of fear. She gave him nothing. Inside, she kept counting. Seconds, breaths, each one bringing her closer to the sound she knew she'd hear before long. The distinct, powerful growl of a truck engine cutting through the stagnant air. When it came, she promised herself she wouldn't flinch. She'd simply step aside and let him handle it, the way he always had when it truly mattered. And then, when it was over, these men would finally understand the danger of assuming they were the only ones in control. The sound reached her first low at the edge of hearing, almost masked by the oppressive hum of the heat. It came as a deep, steady growl, not the rattling whine of an old engine or the rushed roar of someone tearing through town for attention. This was controlled, measured, powerful, the kind of sound that made the air seem to tighten before anything came into view. Gina kept her face neutral, not turning her head toward the street, but inside her chest something eased just slightly. She knew that sound as well as she knew the rhythm of her own heartbeat. The older officer didn't seem to notice it at first, too focused on her, on the little signals he was still hunting for in her expression. The younger one shifted behind her, maybe growing impatient, maybe trying to close the last inches between them so he could bring those cuffs into play. The asphalt radiated heat upward, wrapping around all three of them, a heavy blanket of air that made each breath feel slower. But the sound of that engine was drawing closer, swelling now into something neither man could ignore. She saw the change in their eyes before they said anything, the slight narrowing, the way the older one's gaze flicked toward the street while trying to make it look like nothing. The black pickup appeared a heartbeat later, cutting into the lot with a precision that wasted no motion. Tires rolled over the cracked asphalt, the deep rumble steady as the truck angled toward them, stopping just far enough away to leave space for its driver to step out without obstruction. The door swung open, and Chuck Norris emerged. He wore dark jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, a baseball cap pulled low enough to shade his eyes, but not so low as to hide them. He moved with a calm that was at once unhurried and absolute. His hands were empty, his shoulders loose, his steps even. There was no rush in his approach, but each pace ate up the ground between them with deliberate certainty. He wasn't here to posture. He was here to end this. The older officer straightened, his hand still near his holster but not yet gripping it fully. He tried to speak, though his tone had shifted from the earlier smugness to something more formal, as if attempting to reframe the situation now that there was another witness. The younger officer stayed where he was behind Gina, but his weight shifted uneasily, his smirk replaced with something flatter, harder to read. Chuck didn't respond immediately. His eyes moved from one man to the other, assessing distances, angles, the way each carried his weight. Years of training and competition had taught him to read people in an instant, where they were tense, where they were overconfident, where they were already off balance. His gaze lingered only briefly on the pistol at the older man's side before returning to his face. He closed the gap between them with the same quiet, steady rhythm, his focus absolute. The older officer took a half step forward, his jaw set. He began to speak again, but Chuck's approach didn't slow, and whatever words the man had prepared faltered on his tongue. The air between them seemed to shrink. Then in a flash that was faster than the eye could track, the older officer's hand tightened on his weapon. That was the mistake. Chuck's right hand shot forward, his body turning just enough to put his weight behind the motion. His fingers clamped onto the officer's wrist with precise control, twisting it sharply while his other hand stripped the weapon free in a single motion. The gun was redirected downward and away before the man's mind had fully registered that it was no longer in his possession. A controlled step back gave Chuck the space to flick the weapon aside onto the hood of the patrol car, where it skidded harmlessly to a stop. The younger officer moved then, raising the cuffs as if to bring them down in some improvised strike. Chuck shifted his weight, pivoting into the motion with a fluidity that belied the strength behind it. His hand caught the man's forearm, guiding the strike harmlessly past while his other arm slid under the elbow, levering it up and back in a clean joint lock. The younger officer grunted, his body folding involuntarily as the pressure took hold, his wrist pinned immovably between Chuck's hands. In 2 steps, Chuck guided him to the patrol car, pressing him forward until the cuffs clattered uselessly onto the asphalt. The older officer tried to recover, moving toward Chuck's back as if to grab hold, but Chuck anticipated it, turning his body so that the man's momentum met nothing but empty space. A short, precise sweep of the leg took the man's balance, and he landed hard on one knee, his hand reaching instinctively for the ground to steady himself. Before he could rise, Chuck's hand was on his shoulder, holding him down with just enough force to keep him there without injury. There was no shouting, no wasted movement. Chuck's control over the space was absolute now. He looked at each man in turn, his expression unreadable, his breathing steady. The parking lot was silent except for the faint hum of the truck's engine idling nearby. Gina hadn't moved, her posture still calm, but her eyes followed every shift, every motion, knowing how quickly things could change and how quickly he could adapt. Chuck reached into his pocket, drawing out his phone with the same calm deliberation he'd shown in every step. He placed a call, speaking in a voice low enough that the words were lost to the heat shimmer in the air, but the intent was clear. His gaze never left the 2 men as he spoke, his stance relaxed but immovable. Minutes later, the distant whine of other engines approached, this time accompanied by the heavy thrum of larger vehicles. Black SUVs rolled into the lot, followed by a county sheriff's truck. Uniformed figures emerged, federal agents in tactical vests, their movements purposeful, their attention fixed on the two officers Chuck had already contained. One agent moved immediately to secure the discarded pistol. Another collected the cuffs from the ground. The shift in the air was immediate. The authority these two men had worn like armor minutes before was gone, replaced by the cold reality of their position. Chuck stepped back only when the agents were close enough to take over, his presence still looming in the space between them. Gina watched the scene unfold, her breathing steady, her shoulders beginning to loosen now that the momentum had fully turned. The older officer started to speak again, perhaps to justify himself, but one of the agents cut him off with a raised hand, producing a small recording device that had clearly been running since they stepped out of their vehicle. The younger officer avoided looking at either of them, his jaw clenched tight. Chuck said nothing more. He didn't need to. The balance had shifted the moment that truck rolled into the lot, and everything that followed had been inevitable. The men who had believed themselves untouchable were now in the custody of people they couldn't intimidate, under the eye of a man they couldn't overpower. And for the first time that day, the heat in the parking lot seemed to lift, replaced by the clean, decisive cool of resolution. The black SUVs and the sheriff's truck formed a half circle around the patrol car, their presence swallowing the space with an authority that didn't need to be spoken. The idling engines filled the lot with a low mechanical hum, undercut by the occasional crunch of boots on asphalt as agents and deputies moved into position. The sun was still high, pouring relentless light over everything, but the heat no longer carried the same weight for Gina. The pressure that had been wrapped around her since the patrol car rolled in was dissipating, burned away not by the sun, but by the simple fact that the men who had cornered her were no longer in control. Chuck stood a short distance from them now, his posture relaxed but still angled just enough to react if either man made a sudden move. He had already stepped back to allow the agents to take over, but it was impossible to miss the way both officers kept darting wary glances in his direction. The older one, still kneeling from the sweep that had dropped him, shifted uncomfortably under the firm grip of a federal agent who had arrived with the first SUV. The younger one had been walked to the rear of the patrol car, his wrists secured in a pair of cuffs far sturdier than the ones he'd been spinning idly minutes before. One of the agents, a tall woman in a dark tactical vest, with the crisp, almost military precision of someone who'd spent years in federal service, approached Gina first. Her tone was professional, her questions direct but measured. Was she injured? Had either man made physical contact? Were there any witnesses she had seen before the arrival of the black pickup? Gina answered with the same composure she'd shown throughout the ordeal, describing the sequence of events from the moment the patrol car pulled into the lot. The agent's expression remained neutral, but there was a tightening around her eyes as she listened, as though she were mentally marking each escalation. While they spoke, other agents moved to secure evidence. Two entered the convenience store, emerging moments later with the store's security DVR unit in a sealed evidence bag. Another was crouched near the vending machines, retrieving a small dome-shaped security camera that faced the parking lot. Across the way, an agent with a body-mounted camera photographed the discarded patrol-issued pistol, where it had come to rest on the hood of the cruiser before another agent lifted it, bagging and tagging it with quiet efficiency. The metallic snap of the evidence bag's seal was loud in the still air. A paramedic in a white shirt and navy trousers approached Gina with a kit in hand. She resisted at first, saying she felt fine, but the paramedic insisted on checking her wrists and arms for signs of restraint or injury. There were faint marks where the older officer's fingers had closed around her forearm, nothing broken but enough to document. A photograph was taken, the flash momentarily catching the sunlight, and a notation was made in the medic's log. They offered to transport her for further evaluation, but she declined with quiet finality. The older officer finally found his voice as two agents pulled him to his feet. He began to speak in a tone halfway between defensive bluster and forced calm, claiming there had been a misunderstanding, that they had been following procedure. His words carried no conviction now, and the female agent who had taken Gina's statement cut him off without raising her voice. She informed him that any statements would be recorded formally during questioning, and that for now he was to remain silent unless addressed directly. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. The younger officer stayed quieter, though his eyes were restless, flicking from one uniform to the next as though searching for an ally in the crowd. None met his gaze with anything resembling sympathy. When one of the agents read him the list of charges being recommended, assault, attempted unlawful detention, threat with a deadly weapon, and misconduct under color of law, his face drained of color. The words were delivered in the same calm tone one might use to recite an inventory, but they carried the weight of a gavel strike. From the edge of the lot, the county sheriff arrived, a tall man with weathered skin and a walk that suggested he'd been in this line of work for decades. He took in the scene quickly, his eyes moving from the secured suspects to Chuck, then to Gina. Without fanfare, he exchanged a few low words with the lead federal agent. There was no challenge to jurisdiction. The presence of the SUVs had already made it clear who was in command of the scene. Still, the sheriff's arrival underscored the gravity of what had just happened. The two men in uniform were no longer simply being reprimanded. They were being removed from the profession entirely. As the arrests were finalized, the process unfolded with clinical precision. The older officer was searched thoroughly, his badge and identification removed and placed in a sealed pouch. His nameplate was unpinned from his shirt and dropped into a separate evidence bag. The younger officer underwent the same process, each step documented by the agent with a body-mounted camera. When the reading of their rights concluded, both were escorted toward separate SUVs, their movements guided firmly but without unnecessary roughness. The sound of the doors closing was heavy, final. Gina stood beside Chuck now, though neither spoke. There was no need. The agent still worked around them, but the dangerous energy that had filled the air before was gone. In its place was a quiet, purposeful order. Chuck's gaze followed the vehicles as they began to roll toward the exit of the lot, each carrying one of the men who had assumed this would be just another day where their authority went unquestioned. A few bystanders had gathered at the far end of the lot, drawn by the sight of the federal vehicles and the unmistakable shift in atmosphere. Their murmurs were faint, speculative, but neither Chuck nor Gina paid them any attention. This was not a spectacle for them. It was the closing of a chapter that had, until minutes ago, been balanced on a knife's edge. Once the last SUV had left, the lead federal agent approached Chuck and Gina together. She spoke briefly, confirming that their statements would be followed up with formal documentation and that the case would proceed to federal court. She handed Gina a card with her direct contact information, her expression softening just enough to suggest both professional respect and personal acknowledgement of what had nearly occurred. When the final patrol car pulled away and the lot began to empty, the oppressive heat seemed to settle back into place. Yet for Gina, it no longer carried the same weight. The silence left behind was not the charged, dangerous kind that had preceded the confrontation. It was a clean quiet, one that marked the end of something ugly. She glanced up at Chuck, and he met her gaze briefly before looking toward the road where the SUVs had disappeared. There was no triumph in his eyes, only the steady certainty of someone who had done exactly what was necessary. They turned back toward his truck without a word, the space between them filled with an unspoken understanding. This was over, and for the men who had thought themselves untouchable, the fallout had only just begun. The drive back was quiet, the hum of the truck's engine the only sound between them for most of the way. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, and the light had shifted from harsh white to a warmer, more forgiving gold. Shadows stretched long across the two-lane road, dancing over the hood as Chuck guided the pickup through the familiar curves leading toward their property. Gina sat in the passenger seat, her hands resting loosely in her lap, the faint trace of the day's strain still visible in the set of her shoulders. Neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with words. The absence of conversation wasn't emptiness, it was relief. When they reached the long gravel driveway that wound through the outer edge of their land, the crunch of the tires was a welcome sound. It spoke of home, of a place that was theirs and untouchable, where no one could walk in uninvited and turn the air dangerous. The trees lining the drive filtered the late light into gentle patterns that played across the windshield. In the distance, the outline of the house came into view, its familiar roof line and wide porch carrying with them the promise of normalcy. Chuck parked the truck in its usual spot and killed the engine. The sudden stillness seemed to amplify the quiet of the evening, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the faint breeze. They stepped out together, the warm air still clinging to them, but softer now, no longer heavy with threat. As they made their way toward the front steps, Gina let her fingers trail along the smooth wooden railing, grounding herself in the tangible comfort of home. Inside, the cool air greeted them. Chuck had set the thermostat low before leaving earlier that day, and now it felt like a shield against everything they had left behind in that parking lot. The familiar scent of cedar from the furniture mingled with the faint trace of coffee from the morning pot still lingering in the kitchen. Gina kicked off her sandals and left them neatly by the door. Chuck set his keys on the small table just inside the entryway, the sound of metal on wood a quiet punctuation mark on the day. Gina moved toward the window in the living room, where the fading sunlight spilled across the floor in wide golden bands. She settled into the armchair by the glass, drawing her knees up slightly and wrapping her arms loosely around them. From here she could see the edge of the pasture, and beyond that, the line of trees that marked the property's border. She stared for a moment, not at anything in particular, but letting her eyes rest where they would, her breathing evening out as the minutes passed. Chuck lingered near the kitchen for a moment, scanning the room with a practiced eye. It was habit for him to check the locks and sight lines whenever they came home from something that had put either of them in harm's way. Satisfied, he poured 2 mugs of tea from the kettle he had set on earlier, the earthy steam curling into the air. He brought one to her, setting it gently on the small table beside her chair, before taking his own seat across from her. They didn't speak at first. There was no need. The quiet between them was filled with an unspoken exchange. Her acknowledgement of what he had done without hesitation, his awareness of what she had endured before he arrived. He knew she had kept her composure under pressure, that she hadn't given them any opening to twist the situation further against her. She knew that when she'd made the call, he would come without a second thought, and that when he arrived, he would not just intervene, but end it in a way that left no room for further harm. Outside, the light continued to fade, the sky shifting toward the deep blues of early evening. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, its cry carrying faintly through the open window. The sound didn't unsettle either of them. It was just the landscape speaking in its own voice, part of the rhythm of the place they called home. Chuck leaned back in his chair, the tea cooling slowly in his hands. His mind was not on the fight. He had no need to replay the moments of disarming and restraint. Those were as instinctive to him as breathing. Instead, he thought about the look in the younger officer's eyes when he realized that this was a fight he could not win, about the way the older one's voice had faltered when authority had shifted out of his reach. He didn't take satisfaction in their humiliation, But he did take satisfaction in the certainty that they would never again have the chance to put someone else through what Gina had faced today. For her part, Gina let her mind drift in and out of the moments that had brought them here. The oppressive heat of the asphalt lot, the calculated steps of the men as they closed in, the feel of the phone in her hand as she made the call. But she didn't dwell on the fear. She dwelled on the choice to stay calm, on the knowledge that she had not allowed them the power of seeing her rattled. And she dwelled on the moment the truck appeared, a dark, steady shape cutting through the shimmering air, and the knowledge that the balance had shifted the instant his boots touched the ground. They stayed like that for a long time, letting the day unwind itself into the stillness of the evening. At some point, Chuck rose to check the back door and the small mudroom beyond, another habit ingrained from years of discipline and vigilance. When he returned, he set his phone on the table between them. The screen lit briefly as he placed it down, and there, near the top of the contacts list, was her name marked with a note in small, unmissable text. Answer always. Her eyes flicked to it, then to him. He said nothing, only took his seat again, and she didn't comment. They didn't need to. The meaning was as clear as if he'd spoken it aloud. This house, this space, their life together. It was built on that kind of trust and that kind of promise. By the time the tea had cooled to the point where neither of them noticed drinking it, the sky outside had deepened to full night. The stars were beginning to appear, scattered points of light above the dark line of trees. Chuck stood and moved to the window beside her, looking out into the quiet. She leaned back in her chair, watching him for a moment, and felt the day's weight lift just a little more. Whatever the next day brought, this one had ended here, in a place where respect was not asked for, but understood, where safety was not a hope, but a given. And that, she thought, was all either of them had really needed tonight. Don't miss what's coming next. Hit subscribe now and turn on notifications so you're the first to see our next shocking story. Watch more incredible videos like this one right here and share it with your friends so they can see the truth unfold too. The next twist will leave you speechless. You won't want to miss it.